The autumn air in Millbrook, Michigan, carried the scent of dying leaves and desperation as cattle trucks rumbled into the Westfield Livestock Auction House. It was the kind of gray October morning that made everything look older, sadder, ready for endings. Inside the weathered barn, fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows on the wooden bleachers where farmers, ranchers, and meat buyers sat clutching coffee cups and bidding numbers. Mason Caldwell adjusted his tailored wool coat and checked his Rolex, a far cry from the threadbare clothes and empty pockets of his childhood in this very town. At 35, he was everything Millbrook had never expected him to become: successful, wealthy, respected. His Caldwell cattle ranch had become one of Michigan's most profitable operations, spanning 8,000 acres of prime grazing land and housing some of the finest breeding stock in the Midwest. But today, Mason wasn't here to buy prize bulls or championship heifers. He'd driven the 2 hours from his ranch following a phone call from his old friend Tommy Rodriguez, the auction house manager, who'd mentioned something about cleaning out the kill pen before winter set in. Mason had a policy of rescuing cattle destined for slaughter when he could afford it, a small act of mercy that his board of directors tolerated because Mason Caldwell's instincts for profitable livestock had never failed them. "Lot 47, announced Buck Williams, the gravel-voiced auctioneer who'd been calling sales at Westfield for 23 years. "Mixed lot of cull cattle, sold as is for slaughter. Starting bid at $200 per head." Mason barely looked up from his phone, scrolling through ranch reports while half listening to the proceedings. The kill pen sales were always depressing. Old dairy cows past their prime, injured steers, animals that had outlived their economic usefulness. He'd make his usual token bid on a few head, knowing that most would end up on trucks headed to processing plants by sundown. "Come on now, folks," Buck continued, his voice echoing through the half-empty barn. "This is good commercial-grade beef. 3 bulls, 8 cows, couple of steers. What am I bid for the lot?" The sparse crowd remained largely silent. Kill pen cattle rarely generated excitement, especially this late in the season when winter feed costs were climbing and profit margins were shrinking. A few meat buyers exchanged glances, calculating transportation costs against per-pound prices. "$250, called out a voice from the back. Mason recognized Lou Hendricks, a processor from Grand Rapids who specialized in low-grade beef for pet food manufacturers. "$250 bid, looking for $300, Buck chanted. "These animals got some life left in them. That big black bull there, he's probably good for another season or two with proper feeding." Something in Buck's tone made Mason glance toward the holding pen for the first time. What he saw there made his blood freeze in his veins. Standing in the corner of the crowded pen, partially hidden behind several Holstein dairy cows, was a bull that shouldn't exist anymore. A bull that had haunted Mason's dreams and shaped his destiny 25 years ago. The animal was older now, his black coat dulled with age and poor nutrition, his massive frame reduced to skin hanging loose over prominent ribs. But the scars were unmistakable. 3 parallel lines across his left shoulder where another bull's horns had raked flesh from bone. A notched left ear from an old injury. And most telling of all, a distinctive white patch in the shape of a crescent moon on his forehead, now mostly hidden by the way he held his head low in defeat. Mason's hands began to tremble as memories crashed over him like a dam bursting. He was 10 years old again, small for his age, wearing clothes that never quite fit and shoes held together with duct tape. His father had been dead for 2 years, killed in a factory accident that left the family with nothing but debt and a failing 20-acre farm on the outskirts of Millbrook. $300, someone bid, snapping Mason back to the present. $300 bid, looking for $350, Buck continued. Going once at $300, Mason shot to his feet, his voice cutting through the auction house like a whip crack. "Wait!" Every head in the barn turned toward him. Buck Williams paused mid-sentence, his gavel frozen in the air. The cattle in the pen shifted nervously at the sudden commotion, but the old black bull raised his head for the first time, as if responding to something familiar in Mason's voice. "I'll take him," Mason said, his voice steady despite the emotional earthquake happening inside his chest. He pointed directly at the black bull, who was now looking straight at him with eyes that held the same quiet intelligence Mason remembered from a quarter-century ago. Buck looked confused. "Sir, this is a lot sale. You can't bid on individual animals from a mixed lot." "Then I'll take the entire lot," Mason replied without hesitation. $5,000 for all of them." The auction house erupted in surprised murmurs. 5,000 was more than triple what the lot was worth as slaughter cattle. Lou Hendricks shook his head in disgust and sat back down, knowing he'd been priced out by someone who clearly wasn't thinking with business sense. Buck Williams stared at Mason with the expression of a man who'd seen everything in 23 years of auctioneering, but had never seen anything quite like this. "Sir, are you sure? That's a considerable sum for cull cattle." Mason pulled out his checkbook, his hands still shaking slightly as he began writing. "I'm sure. This bull may look ordinary to you, but I know those scars. He changed my life." The old bull continued to watch Mason, and for just a moment something flickered in his dark eyes, a spark of recognition, a memory of a terrified 10-year-old boy whose life had been saved by an act of bovine heroism that defied explanation. "Sold to Mason Caldwell for $5,000, Buck announced, bringing his gavel down with a sharp crack that seemed to echo with the weight of 25 years of gratitude finally finding its voice. As Mason walked toward the pen to get a closer look at the bull who had once saved his life, he could almost hear the ghosts of his childhood whispering around him. The sound of his mother crying over unpaid bills, the rumble of his empty stomach during those lean years, and beneath it all, the terrifying bellow of a massive red bull named Rage, who had come within inches of ending Mason's story before it had really begun. But that was a different time, a different life. Today, Mason Caldwell had the power to repay a debt that had shaped everything he'd become. Today, he could save the hero who had once saved him. The old bull, Ironheart, though he'd forgotten that name long ago, watched the successful man approach and felt something stir in his chest that he hadn't experienced in years. Not hope exactly, but something close to it. Something that whispered that maybe, just maybe, some stories got second chapters after all. 25 years earlier, the Caldwell farm was a monument to broken dreams and empty promises. The 20 acres that Mason's grandfather had once worked with pride had become a patchwork of failed crops, broken fencing, and buildings that leaked more than they sheltered. After his father's death in the factory accident, 10-year-old Mason had become the man of the house by default, though he barely weighed 70 pounds and stood shorter than most kids 2 years younger. His mother, Linda Caldwell, worked 3 jobs just to keep the electricity on and food on the table, cleaning offices before dawn, serving lunch at the diner downtown, and stocking shelves at the grocery store until midnight. But even that wasn't enough. The medical bills from his father's accident had consumed their savings, and the bank was threatening foreclosure. They were 3 months behind on everything, surviving on government cheese and the kindness of neighbors who weren't much better off themselves. The cattle were all they had left, 6 aging dairy cows that barely produced enough milk to justify the feed they consumed, and 2 bulls that Mason's father had bought in better times. One was Ironheart, a gentle giant with intelligent eyes and a protective nature that made him more like a massive pet than livestock. The other was Rage, a red Angus bull whose name perfectly described his temperament. Rage had been a mistake from the beginning. Mason's father had bought him cheap from a dealer who'd failed to mention the animal's violent history. The bull was massive, aggressive, and had already injured 2 farmhands before Mason's father died. Linda wanted to sell him, but nobody would buy a bull with Rage's reputation, and they couldn't afford the cost of professional transport to an auction house. On that cold October morning, Mason had been tasked with moving the cattle from the back pasture to the barn for winter feeding. It was a job that normally required 2 adults, but Linda was already at her first job, and Mason had done it before with help from Ironheart, who seemed to understand that the boy needed protection and guidance. Mason had successfully moved 5 of the cows when disaster struck. A loose board in the fence spooked Rage, who had been peacefully grazing near the pasture gate. The bull's head snapped up, his eyes wild with sudden fury, and he locked onto the only target available, a small boy in a worn denim jacket who suddenly looked very much like prey. The charge came without warning. One moment, Mason was latching the gate behind the last cow. The next, he was running for his life across an open field with 1,800 pounds of murderous beef bearing down on him. Mason's short legs were no match for Rage's powerful stride. Within seconds, the bull was close enough that Mason could hear his labored breathing, could feel the ground shaking with each thunderous step. Mason stumbled, his worn sneakers slipping on the frost-covered grass. He went down hard, skinning his knees and palms, rolling instinctively as Raj's massive hooves struck the ground where his head had been a split second earlier. The bull wheeled around for another charge, his eyes red with fury, steam rising from his nostrils in the cold morning air. That's when Ironheart appeared like a black thunderbolt from the far side of the pasture. The collision between the two bulls was like watching freight trains crash. Ironheart hit Rage with enough force to drive him sideways, their massive bodies slamming together with a sound that echoed across the valley. Ironheart was smaller than Rage, probably 300 pounds lighter, but he fought with the fury of a bull protecting his own calf. Mason scrambled to his feet and ran toward the barn, but he couldn't help looking back at the epic battle unfolding behind him. The two bulls were locked in mortal combat, their heads down, hooves churning up great clods of frozen earth as they pushed against each other with all their strength. Rage was winning through sheer size and brutality, driving Ironheart backward step by step. Then Rage broke free and lunged with his horns. Ironheart tried to dodge, but wasn't quite fast enough. Rage's horn tips raked across Ironheart's left shoulder, opening 3 parallel gashes that immediately began streaming blood. The sight of his own blood seemed to enrage Ironheart, rather than weaken him. He bellowed with a sound that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth, then launched himself at Rage with renewed fury. The battle raged for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Both bulls were bleeding, exhausted, their sides heaving with the effort, but Ironheart refused to yield. Every time Rage tried to break away and pursue Mason, Ironheart would block his path, absorbing punishment but never backing down. Finally, Rage had enough. The Red Bull turned and thundered away toward the far corner of the pasture, defeated not by superior strength but by superior heart. Ironheart stood over Mason like a black mountain, blood streaming from his wounds, his dark eyes filled with an intelligence that seemed almost human. Mason reached up with a trembling hand and touched Ironheart's massive head. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice breaking with emotion. "Thank you for saving me." Ironheart lowered his head and gently nuzzled the boy's shoulder, his breath warm against Mason's neck. It was a moment of connection that transcended species, a bond forged in violence but sealed with gratitude and love. The veterinary bills for Ironheart's wounds cost the family their last $300, money they didn't have but couldn't refuse to spend. Sarah Martinez, the local veterinarian, had patched up Ironheart's shoulder and treated the infected gash on his ear, but she'd warned that the bull would carry those scars for life. "He's a hero," Dr. Martinez had told Linda as they watched Ironheart recover in the barn. Most bulls would have run when faced with an animal as aggressive as Rage. This one chose to fight. 2 weeks later, the bank foreclosed on the farm. Linda and Mason lost everything. The land, the house, the remaining cattle, even Ironheart. The bull that had saved Mason's life was sold to cover a fraction of their debts, disappearing into the vast network of livestock dealers and auction houses that moved cattle across the Midwest like living commodities. Mason never forgot the sight of Ironheart being loaded into a livestock trailer, his dark eyes looking back at the boy one last time before the metal doors clanged shut. It was the last time Mason cried about anything for the next 15 years, but it was also the moment that shaped everything Mason would become. That night, lying on a mattress in his cousin's spare room, Mason made a promise to himself. Someday, when he was old enough and strong enough and wealthy enough, he would find Ironheart again. Someday, he would repay the debt of a life saved by sacrificing everything. What Mason didn't know was that Ironheart had spent the next 25 years moving from farm to farm, auction to auction, never staying anywhere long enough to form new bonds. The scars on his shoulder marked him as damaged goods, and his gentle nature was mistaken for weakness in a world that valued aggression and profit over loyalty and heart. Now, standing in the auction house pen, waiting for a truck that would take him to slaughter, Ironheart had given up hope of ever seeing the boy he'd saved. But something in Mason's voice had stirred old memories, awakened feelings he'd thought were dead. As Mason approached the pen with tears streaming down his face, Ironheart raised his great head and looked into the eyes of the man that boy had become. And for the first time in 25 years, both of them remembered what it felt like to be home. The years after losing the farm transformed Mason Caldwell from a broken 10-year-old into a man driven by purpose that burned like a forge fire in his chest. He and his mother moved to Grand Rapids, where Linda found steady work at a medical supply company, and Mason threw himself into school with the intensity of someone who understood that education was his only weapon against poverty. But every decision Mason made was shaped by the memory of Ironheart's sacrifice. When other kids spent summers playing video games or swimming at the lake, Mason worked at Johnson's feed store, learning everything he could about cattle nutrition, breeding, and market prices. When his high school guidance counselor suggested he consider college majors, Mason chose agricultural business without hesitation, despite never having stepped foot on a farm since losing his own. He earned a full scholarship to Michigan State University, where he studied with a focus that impressed even his professors. But the real education happened during summers and weekends, when Mason would drive hundreds of miles to work on cattle ranches across Michigan, Illinois, and Ohio. He mucked stalls, mended fences, helped with difficult births, and absorbed every piece of knowledge about the cattle industry that he could find. By age 22, Mason had graduated summa cum laude and accepted a position with Midwest Cattle Consortium, a major agricultural investment firm. His starting salary was more money than his mother had made in her best year, but Mason lived like a monk, saving every penny and studying market trends with the obsession of a man on a mission. He had never stopped looking for Ironheart. Every weekend, Mason would drive to livestock auctions throughout the Midwest, ostensibly scouting investment opportunities for his firm, but really searching the pens for a black bull with 3 parallel scars on his left shoulder. He'd developed a network of contacts, auctioneers, livestock dealers, veterinarians, who knew to call him if they ever came across an unusual bull matching Ironheart's description. The search consumed him for 15 years. Mason would lie awake at night, wondering if Ironheart was still alive, if the bull who'd saved his life was being properly cared for or suffering in some neglected pasture. He'd seen enough of the livestock industry to know that cattle were commodities first and individuals never, that an aging bull with battle scars would be considered worthless by most farmers. But Mason's dedication to finding his hero also fueled his rise in the cattle industry. His intimate knowledge of auctions and livestock markets made him invaluable to the consortium. By age 30, he was managing a $50 million cattle investment portfolio. By 32, he'd saved enough to purchase his first ranch, 800 acres of prime grazing land in central Michigan that he named Caldwell Cattle Ranch. The ranch became Mason's masterpiece, a testament to what determination and smart investing could accomplish. He specialized in breeding premium Black Angus cattle, ironic given his traumatic encounter with rage, but he'd learned to separate the character of individual animals from their breed. His bulls were known for their docile temperaments and superior genetics, commanding top dollar at breeding auctions across the country. Mason's success attracted attention from agricultural magazines and livestock publications. They wrote articles about the miracle transformation of a poor farm boy into one of Michigan's most successful cattle ranchers. But in every interview, Mason would steer the conversation toward a seemingly casual question. Had anyone ever seen an older Black Angus bull with distinctive scars on his left shoulder? The irony wasn't lost on Mason that he'd built an empire searching for one particular bull, yet owned hundreds of cattle he barely knew as individuals. His ranch hands sometimes joked that Mr. Caldwell cared more about finding some mythical scarred bull than he did about the prize-winning animals in his own pastures. They weren't entirely wrong. Meanwhile, Ironheart's journey through the cattle industry had been a slow descent into anonymity and neglect. After being sold from the Caldwell farm, he'd spent a year on a dairy operation where his gentle nature made him useful for keeping aggressive bulls in line. But when the dairy switched to artificial insemination, Ironheart was sold again. From there, he'd moved through a succession of small farms and livestock dealers, each transition reducing his value and prospects. His scars marked him as damaged goods, and his advancing age made him less desirable for breeding. Farmers would keep him for a season or two, then sell him when they needed quick cash or space for younger animals. Ironheart had learned not to form attachments. 25 years of temporary homes had taught him that every pasture was temporary. Every farmer was eventually going to load him onto another trailer bound for another stranger's land. He'd stopped responding to names, stopped seeking human contact, stopped hoping for anything beyond adequate food and shelter. The worst period came when Ironheart was 12 years old and sold to a man named Carl Brennan, who ran a struggling operation outside of Battle Creek. Brennan was bitter about his own failures and took his frustrations out on his animals. Ironheart spent 3 years underfed and neglected, his once magnificent frame shrinking as poor nutrition and indifference took their toll. When Brennan finally went bankrupt, Ironheart was among the assets seized by creditors and sold to whoever would take them. He ended up at a livestock auction in Kalamazoo, where he was purchased by a meat buyer for $60 above slaughter price. For the next 8 years, Ironheart lived on a commercial feeding operation where cattle were fattened for processing, knowing that every day might be his last. But even as his body aged and weakened, Ironheart never forgot the 10-year-old boy he'd saved. Sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, he would raise his scarred head and listen to the wind, wondering if somewhere in the vast world beyond the fences, that boy had grown up to be safe and strong. The feeding operation eventually sold out to a larger corporation, and Ironheart found himself back in the auction system at age 27, ancient by cattle standards, his value reduced to meat weight and nothing more. The Westfield auction house was supposed to be his final stop, the kill pen his last pasture. Until a voice from his past called out, "Wait," and changed everything. As Mason completed the paperwork for his $5,000 purchase, his hands still shaking with the magnitude of the moment, he couldn't stop staring at Ironheart through the pen bars. 25 years had aged both of them, but the essential connection remained. The bull who had sacrificed his body to save a child's life. The man who had built an empire while searching for his hero. Tommy Rodriguez, the auction manager, shook his head in amazement as he processed the sale. "Mason, I've known you for 10 years, and I've never seen you bid on cull cattle. What's so special about that old bull?" Mason smiled through his tears, remembering a terrified 10-year-old boy and a black giant who'd stood between him and death. "He taught me what courage looks like, Tommy. 25 years ago, when I had nothing, he gave me everything. Today, I finally get to return the favor." As the livestock trailer pulled away from the auction house with Ironheart safely inside, Mason followed in his truck, speaking quietly into his phone to arrange veterinary care, nutritional supplements, and a private pasture where an old hero could spend his remaining years in comfort and dignity. Behind them, the auction continued, but two souls who had shaped each other's destinies were finally heading home together. The Caldwell cattle ranch had never welcomed a more important visitor. As the livestock trailer pulled through the gates, Mason felt his heart hammering against his ribs with the same intensity as that terrifying day 25 years ago. But this time, fear had been replaced by overwhelming gratitude and an almost desperate need to make things right. Dr. Amanda Chen, the ranch's head veterinarian, was already waiting in the main barn with her medical kit and a concerned expression. Mason had called ahead, explaining only that he was bringing in an elderly bull who needed immediate assessment and long-term rehabilitation. He hadn't mentioned the personal connection. Some stories were too sacred to share until the right moment. When the trailer doors opened, revealing Ironheart's weathered frame in the harsh afternoon light, Dr. Chen drew in a sharp breath. "Mason, this animal is severely malnourished. Look at his muscle wastage, the condition of his coat. How long has he been neglected?" Mason climbed into the trailer, approaching Ironheart with the same slow, careful movements he'd used as a child. The bull watched him with eyes that held wariness, mixed with something that might have been hope. When Mason extended his hand, Ironheart sniffed cautiously, then gently pressed his massive muzzle against Mason's palm. The same gesture of trust he'd offered 25 years ago. "Too long," Mason whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "He's been neglected for far too long." The rehabilitation process began immediately. Dr. Chen discovered that Ironheart was suffering from malnutrition, dental issues that made eating difficult, and arthritis in his joints from years of standing on concrete. His famous scars had reopened and become infected during his final weeks at the feeding operation, and his hooves hadn't been properly trimmed in months. Mason spared no expense. He converted the ranch's premium isolation barn into a private recovery facility for Ironheart, complete with soft rubber matting, automatic waterers, and a specialized feeding system that delivered small, frequent meals of high-quality nutrition. He hired a massage therapist who specialized in large animals and arranged for daily physical therapy sessions to ease Ironheart's arthritic joints. The ranch hands thought their boss had lost his mind, spending thousands of dollars on veterinary care for a bull who would never produce income or offspring. But Mason's foreman, Carlos Mendez, who'd worked with Mason for 8 years, recognized something deeper in his employer's eyes whenever he looked at the old bull. "There's history here," Carlos told his wife over dinner one evening. "Mr. Caldwell looks at that bull like he's looking at family." The first few weeks were touch and go. Ironheart's digestive system had been damaged by years of poor nutrition, and his body struggled to process the rich feeds Mason provided. There were nights when Mason slept in the barn, monitoring Ironheart's condition and talking softly to him about the ranch, about his mother Linda, who still lived in Grand Rapids, about the successful life he'd built on the foundation of courage that Ironheart had taught him. Slowly, miraculously, Ironheart began to improve. His coat started to shine again, revealing the deep black color that had made him so striking in his youth. His eyes cleared and brightened. Most importantly, his appetite returned with a vengeance, as if he were making up for years of inadequate feeding. One morning in late November, 3 weeks after arriving at the ranch, Ironheart did something that brought tears to Mason's eyes. The bull had been released into a small paddock for exercise when Mason approached the fence. Instead of maintaining the cautious distance he'd kept since his arrival, Ironheart walked directly to Mason and lowered his great head, allowing the man to scratch behind his ears the way Mason had done as a child. "You remember, don't you?" Mason whispered. "You remember saving that scared little boy." Dr. Chen, who had been monitoring the interaction from a distance, finally understood what she was witnessing. "He saved your life, didn't he? When you were young." Mason nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. He'd never told the full story to anyone, but standing there with Ironheart's head pressed against his chest, the words poured out. He told Dr. Chen about the poverty, the failing farm, the terrifying charge of rage, and the black bull who had sacrificed his own body to protect a defenseless child. "Every success I've had, every acre of this ranch, every prize bull in my pastures, it all started with his courage," Mason said. "I've spent 25 years trying to become worthy of what he gave me." By spring, Ironheart's transformation was complete. The skeletal, defeated bull who had arrived in October had been replaced by a magnificent animal who moved with dignity and purpose. He'd gained over 300 pounds of healthy weight. His scars had healed into silver lines that looked more like medals than wounds, and his presence commanded respect from every animal on the ranch. Mason had built Ironheart a private 10-acre pasture with a view of the main ranch, where he could graze peacefully while watching the daily operations. The other cattle seemed to sense something special about the old bull, often gathering near his fence as if seeking his approval or wisdom. But the most remarkable change was in Mason himself. The driven, obsessed businessman who had spent 15 years searching for his hero finally found peace. He began spending more time on the ranch and less time traveling to auctions. He started remembering the names of his cattle again, treating them as individuals rather than investments. On the 1-year anniversary of Ironheart's rescue, Mason organized a small celebration at the ranch. Linda Caldwell, now 72 and retired, made the trip from Grand Rapids to meet the bull who had shaped her son's destiny. Dr. Chen brought her family, and Carlos invited the ranch hands who had helped care for Ironheart during his recovery. As the group gathered around Ironheart's pasture, Mason told the complete story for the first time. The poverty, the foreclosure, the epic battle, and the decades-long search that had brought them to this moment. When he finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the crowd. Linda Caldwell approached the fence where Ironheart stood, watching the proceedings with calm intelligence. "Thank you," she said simply. "Thank you for saving my boy and making him the man he became." Ironheart regarded her with the same gentle wisdom he'd shown as a young bull, then walked over and allowed her to touch his forehead, a gesture of acceptance that left everyone present deeply moved. As the celebration wound down and guests departed, Mason remained in the pasture with Ironheart, both of them watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. The bull grazed peacefully nearby, occasionally lifting his head to check on the man who had saved him from slaughter. "I never stopped looking for you," Mason said quietly. "Every auction, every farm, every cattle dealer from here to Montana. I knew someday I'd find you again." Ironheart moved closer, his massive presence a comfort rather than a threat. In the fading light, the scars on his shoulder looked less like wounds and more like proof of the extraordinary bond between a boy and his hero. Dr. Chen estimated that Ironheart, now 28 years old, had perhaps 2 or 3 good years remaining. But they would be years of comfort, dignity, and love. A small repayment for a debt that could never truly be settled. As darkness fell over the Caldwell cattle ranch, man and bull stood together in comfortable silence, two souls whose destinies had been forever intertwined by a moment of courage that transcended species. The scared 10-year-old boy had grown into a successful man, but he had never forgotten the lesson his hero had taught him. That true strength isn't measured by size or power, but by the willingness to sacrifice everything to protect those who cannot protect themselves. In saving Ironheart from the slaughter truck, Mason had completed a circle that began 25 years ago in a frost-covered pasture. But more than that, he had proven that some debts of gratitude are so profound they can reshape entire lives and create legacies that echo through generations. The boy who was saved had become the man who saves. And in the quiet pastures of the Caldwell cattle ranch, a hero finally found the peace he had earned through a lifetime of sacrifice and courage.